So hello everyone and welcome to this session. My name is Nikki and I'm the Education Coordinator here at the BCACC. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to our very first Mind Matters public educational event. Essentially, they're dedicated to providing meaningful information to the public on topics, everything to do with mental health and well-being. So Ed Chen and PJ Lewis, they're both RCCs, so members of the BCACC, clinical counselors. They both have extensive experience in delivering dialectical behavioral therapy. They will give you a sense of what that is once they get into their talk. I'm not going to try to broach that topic. They deliver it to high-risk youth and families experiencing concerns such as suicidality and self-harm. So I'm simply going to hand it over and thank you both for putting your names forward and really bringing this important topic to people this evening. We really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you, Nikki, for the introductions. Good evening, everybody. Like Nikki said, my name is Ed, and that's my colleague there, PJ. We're here from the DB Center at the Fraser Valley, and today's workshop is titled Helping Teens Who Cut. So let's do a bit of an orientation before we start our workshop today. So number one, who are we? So I'm not going to introduce yourselves for a third time since we already had a bit of introduction. So again, my name is Ed. That's my colleague PJ. So what to expect from this presentation? So we will be talking, about the young people that we often work with, either you're a parent or a youth worker or a teacher or clinician, so on and so forth. And, specifically about self-harm and how to differentiate that from other type of behaviors and what to do. And also in this workshop, we'll give a brief introduction as to, what DBT is. We don't have the time to provide a full training on what DBT is. We only have an hour and a half together, but we will give a quick overview so you get some understanding of what DBT is and what that means, for people who may want to access services or want to know more about DBT. And the other thing is regarding questions and answers. So at the end of today's workshop, we did reserve some time for people to ask their questions, and we're happy to answer them as you ask them. Throughout the presentation, though, if you do have a question, please do ask. Please use the question and answer function rather than chat, because with the chat, sometimes we'll miss it. So please use the question and answer function, and we will answer them, as we go. Now, if your questions are going to be answered by the workshop, as we go along, we also let you know. So if sometimes, sometimes people are a little ahead of the game and they let us know, things they want to know, and we actually let them know, actually, we're going to be talking about it in about 2 seconds. We'll also let you know that. So let's look at some of the things we're going to talk about today. So the agenda. So first of all, we're going to talk about what is self-harm and self-interest behaviors, and actually define the terms. Because in order for us to intervene and even to assist or support, we need to know what they are or what they mean. And then we're going to look at who self-harms. And then why do our young folks that we work with or participate our time with self-harm? And then how do we address it, especially with the young people that we work with? And the end, like I said, there'll be a question and answer period. Now, like all trainings or, either skills trainings for participants or clients through our center or clinicians who's getting training in the modality, or even people who are, doing consultation, what we start with all the time is a mindfulness practice. So much like this workshop, that's what we're going to start with. So today's mindfulness practice has to do with your reactions to the subject matter we're talking about. And this is especially important is because a lot of times interactions, with others, either is with self-harm behaviors occurring or not, begins before the other person's even in the room, because you carry things with you into the room, either how you experience things from the past or currently, or, what may come up for you as you are exposed to specific stimuli. So today's mindfulness exercise deals with that. So we're going to start with 1 bell. We're going to end with 2. The exercise be about 2 minutes. What I'd like you to do is take a moment and notice what your reactions are when you hear the terms self-harm or cutting. And then when you're ready, whatever you have in front of you is your phone, piece of paper, computer, write down your reactions. So we're going to start with 1 bell and end with 2. Okay. Now, due to the volume participants, we are unable to do this part. Usually what we'll do is ask people to share what they noticed. But due to the time constraint and also the number of people we have with us today, we won't be able to do that. But what I'd like you to do is just take a moment and notice what your reactions are. And the reason we do this is actually very important because before you actually work with a young person or communicate or interact with a young person who may be self-harming, what your reactions are and observing that is going to be crucial and really determine how the interaction is going to go. Because if you're anxious, you're going to bring the anxiety in. If you are feeling guilty, that's also will present itself in your interaction with the young person. And just noticing that will allow you to have to be mindful and aware before you begin the interaction. However, let's start with today's content. So let's first define the terms. So when we talk about self-injurious behaviors, there could be a number of things. So it could be what we call an SSI, which stands for non-suicidal self-injury. So we're going to talk more about what that means in a second as to in its definition and intent. So a lot of times, when it comes to behaviors, we got to be very specific. And the specificity then really comes to what the intent of the behavior is. It could also be self-injury, could be deliberate self-harm. So again, there's that intent, could be self-mutilation, could be cutting, or it could be burning. So a quick definition here. So when we talk about self-injurious behaviors, the intentional and direct injuring one's body tissue without suicidal intent. Because if it's with suicidal intent, it's actually no longer just self-injury. Now it's actually with suicide attempt and with the intent to die. So what we're talking about here with NSSI is there is damage, but without the intent to die. Quick answer to the question on the side here, will it be recorded and available? Yes, it will be recorded. Where to find it? I'll let Nikki answer that. I am not the tech person in this workshop. All right. So there's a number of different types. So it could be the intentional cutting or carving skin, and this could be both superficial or deep tissue. Now, a lot of times people will go, well, is that how we determine as to if it's self-injurious or not? Again, it's back to the intent, because a lot of times the cutting may be actually superficial. The intent was to be superficial, that accidentally become too deep. It could be tissue scratching with different tools, could be, scissors, could be safety pins, so on and so forth. Could be burning with cigarettes, lighter, so on and so forth. Could be ripping or pulling of skin or hair, either with a tool or with hands. Could be hitting or banging of head or any of the body parts. Could be biting. So it could be biting oneself, or also biting objects that are not meant to be bit. So then actually creates injury to the mouth, or the tissues within the mouth. So it could also be purging without the intention to eliminate food. So again, it's back to the intention. So the purging here is not to get rid of the food in the stomach. It's actually serving as a regulatory mechanism. We're going to talk more about that in a second, as to what that means, as to what do we mean by this behavior using as a tool of regulation. So let's watch a quick video on some signs where, a young person or a person may be injuring themselves through self-injurious behaviors.
1. They wear long-sleeve shirts and pants in hot weather. Although people may wear these articles of clothing to prevent getting sunburns or mosquito bites, if someone does it consistently, even when they go swimming, then it might indicate they're trying to hide their wounds. People who self-harm may be ashamed of their actions and often have a hard time receiving help, fearing that they will be judged. So, they do whatever it takes to keep it a secret, even if it means wearing a jacket when it's 90 degrees outside. 2. They scratch or rub at certain body areas. This indicates that there's more going on than just a small cut. People who self-harm on a regular basis develop wounds that take a long time to heal because they may keep agitating it. As scar tissue forms, the wounded area often becomes itchy. They may also be selective and choose a specific area to self-harm, such as their wrist, arm, or thigh, to get the same feeling of release each time they hurt themselves. 3. They have unpredictable mood swings and trouble controlling their impulses. People who experience psychological conditions such as mood disorders and trauma are more likely to self-harm because it's hard for them to regulate their emotions. Signs include getting agitated often, breaking down frequently, or seeming easily offended. It's also important to take notice if they crack jokes about self-harm, because chances are they're being serious. 4. They start to withdraw themselves from you and others. People who self-harm often start to isolate themselves from their friends and family. But it's not just their social life they put on pause. If you catch them stop doing their favorite hobbies, this is also a strong indicator that something is wrong. 5. They have frequent episodes of existential crisis. When someone keeps asking themselves who they are or what the meaning of life is, they aren't doing it to be drama queens or kings. Inside, something has snapped that is preventing them from feeling stable. People who self-harm often struggle with low self-esteem issues and have a hard time finding hope. They might feel unmotivated, confused, lonely, and misunderstood. If you notice that their symptoms of anxiety and depression have worsened, please don't leave their side and let them know that professional help is available.
Now, in a video like this, we're speaking in really broad generalizations. There are exceptions to every rule and there are nuances to the applications, but sometimes it's helpful to know broadly what is out there just to gain a little bit of familiarity. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time now looking at the relationship between self-injurious behaviors and suicide, because although that really important differentiation between the intent of the behavior is so critical, and we'll circle back to that shortly, there is a relationship between the two phenomena. And so there's a really high correlation, and there are certain risk and protective factors at play. And so when we look at several sources of research, some of these have carried through into newer studies as well, we notice that 40% of the people who willingly participated in various surveys and self-reported data also reported that they had some experience of suicidality. Now, that experience can range anywhere from ideas or ideation of suicide all the way up to taking actions towards or acting on the urge for suicide. So there's a great variety there, but still to be able to say that there's 40% of the people, so just less than half, but still a significant portion, also reported suicidality. And For those people who reported feeling both engaging in self-injurious behaviors and suicidal behaviors, there was also a high correlation with self-report of a history of trauma or psychological or physical distress, rather than just self-injury and suicide alone. So we're starting to see that when there are more risk factors involved and more adverse childhood experiences, the level of risks and the prevalence of these life-threatening behaviors start to increase. We also see that self-injury is a strong predictor of suicidality. And when we get into the research on suicidality, we also know and can acknowledge that there isn't one single foolproof predictor of suicidality, but certain variables are stronger predictors than others. And self-injury is a strong predictor of risk for suicidality, as is previous suicidal behaviors. And we also know that the relationship between suicidality increases when self-injurious activity increases. And so obviously there could be confounding variables in there. We're not going to get into all the research data and whatnot as well, because usually if those two things are increasing, the level of distress and the level of self-efficacy and coping with that distress is also at play. So it's a very complicated relationship, but there is a relationship. We also see that individuals that use self-injury as a means of coping, they're often coping with undesired emotions. We see that there is a lot of psychological stress, and that this can become very overwhelming of their current capacity to cope, and that when we're in an incredible amount of distress, we tend to be willing to do incredible things to make that distress stop. And there are very powerful physiological actions that get pulled in our body when we engage in self-injury. So when self-injury is present, we know that a suicide risk assessment is prudent. It should be done to determine what is the level of suicidality, what is the nature or the function of the self-harm, are those two interrelated for this person? Those things are important to consider. The critical and crucial variable, as we mentioned off the top, is the intent. So it can be very invalidating for somebody experiencing or engaging in non-suicidal behaviors to show up and disclose that to somebody and have that person assume that they're trying to kill themselves, and even to ask them, why are you trying to kill yourself? Because maybe the intent wasn't to die. And so that can actually be, why are you jumping to conclusions? Why aren't you trying to understand me? So one of the things that we want to consider is, was there an intent to die? Were there preparations for death? The giving away of valuable possessions, the, attempts to avoid discovery, some of those big risk factors that we would see. Were there efforts to avoid discovery or to thwart possible rescue? Those sorts of things. And so once we understand the intent, then we can query a little bit further into that. And we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail as well. Things that are helpful, things that are unhelpful, and things that are probably going to help us to be a little bit more effective as we go through this. So again, when we start looking at who in a 2008 study, which is quite old now, but still not that old, but these numbers tend to have held over the last few years with some of the newer research coming out as well. We see that in a report from the sample size in this particular study was between 3 and 350 participants. And what they noticed was that of the respondents, 17% reported having never engaged in any form of self-injurious behavior, 29% one time, 33% 2 to 3 times, and 38% more than 3 times. What these statistics don't capture is like that is over lifetime report. What this doesn't give us a sense of is the frequency. How is this for people for more than 3 times? Is this happening on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly basis? That we don't know from this particular study. What we also have seen in several studies is that we do see that the overwhelming majority of folks engaging in self-injurious behaviors tend to identify as female. And again, though, we got to pay attention to statistics, is that we also know from the research that females are far more willing to participate in self-report data gathering than males are, and to report accurately. So we have to take that into account as well. But we do see from the data that we do have that it is an overwhelming majority of females who will self-report that they are engaging in self-injurious behaviors. Average age of onset 15. We're starting to actually see that reduce in more recent studies. Some of the stuff coming out more recently from even locally here in BC is showing us that we're seeing an average age of onset getting younger, 14, even 13. We noticed that 1% reported with occasional forms of self-injury within the previous year. 1% reported repetitive forms. So that's telling us that the majority are saying it's happened, but we don't know, somewhere in between occasional and repetitive. So a level of repetition that doesn't get to the point of daily or weekly. So 5% of students who have engaged in self-injury occasionally reported that they have received some sort of psychological treatment or counseling. And 27% of repetitive self-injurers reported that they were also engaging in some sort of treatment. And we also have seen that there was a high correlation between folks that have health problems or mental health concerns in the family or with siblings were associated with a slightly higher increased risk of self-injurious behaviors as well. So one of the studies, that comes through, the respondents were actually asked to give reasons in their own words why they engage in this behavior. And this was one of the responses. I'll read it out loud. The razor cuts into my skin, and this is how it all begins. I blame myself for all of the fights and cried a lot of lonely nights. The flowing blood is on the floor, but still I cut me more and more. I do the drugs to escape the pain. After all, I have nothing to gain. Drugs and razors are my life. They take away my pain and strife. When they're with me, I am glad. And the best thing is, I don't get mad. Just like we started with our mindfulness, being aware of our own responses, this is likely pulled responses from you, even in just hearing me read it. And there's two things in here that I would encourage our attention to go to. And yes, our attention might go to things like some of the descriptive language and whatnot that was used by this young person who described this, or it might go to the poetic language used. But one of the things that I would draw our attention to is this line in here, is that escaping the pain. And the last thing that I ask us to draw our attention to is I don't get mad. Because these two things give us a very important clue. And the very important clue is, what is the function of this behavior? What job is this behavior doing? We believe, we have the assumption that every behavior has meaning and everything is caused. So if we're really curious and non-judgmental, we might actually understand what is driving or perpetuating a behavior, so that we might start to be able to generate alternative things that could be just as effective, so that we don't need this behavior anymore. So we're already getting clues here that there's a desire to escape pain and a desire to avoid getting mad. So that already is giving us really important clues. Some other reasons cited by the research is that relief from stress, to escape certain situations. Because you can imagine, if I'm under a great deal of psychological stress and I injure myself, this could have a number of possible outcomes. Not only might the injury itself help me to escape from thinking about or dwelling on something that's troubling for me, but the responses from the people around me might also cause me to escape. If somebody is acting very caring all of a sudden, or very distressed all of a sudden, now my attention can go to those things instead of the thing that was troubling me. Sometimes it is a display of emotional desperation. I just don't know how else to cope with this distress that I'm feeling. Sometimes it is behavioral experimentation. I read about it online. I saw a blog post. I saw it on Reddit, those sorts of things. A friend of mine does it. I'm just wondering how it works. Sometimes it is imitation of the behavior of others. I heard this works. My friends are doing it. And more often than not, the intention is to regulate intense emotions. We see the research coming back to this again and again and again, is that often if intense emotions are being experienced and there's a low level of self-efficacy in our ability to cope with those emotions, then we tend to go to these more intense or extreme ways to cope and regulate. So other self-descriptions of self-injury have included, I feel it is because I can't handle my emotions very well. When I get really sad or really mad, I feel the need to hurt myself to make me feel better. So you're seeing that function of regulating emotions there. I like the thought that it is me causing the pain for once, not somebody else. So you see that there's a sense of autonomy and control coming out for this particular person. Another respondent said, I injure myself usually when I feel like things aren't in my control, like when I get into a fight with my boyfriend or I feel like nobody cares about me. So also you're seeing a sense of both control and the intense emotions that go along with those types of experiences. So let's take another look at some other self-descriptions of what happens.
It's hard to describe why I would hurt myself. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling.
Cutting my arm was the only way I could release the tension. Once I would do it, I stopped worrying about how I was feeling. It worked, and I really didn't want to stop doing it.
My daughter hurt herself for several years. I was so scared. It also made me angry, so I had to really work to understand what was happening.
As a high school teacher, I would see students who covered cuts on their arms. And I knew one young man who would just hit his head on the wall. He always had bruises. I couldn't tell if he was angry, sad, or just trying to get attention.
So we talked about what self-harm is, and also the why. Now, one question people often have is, how do we get here? What has transpired that got us to now we have a young person who is self-harming and using it oftentimes as a way to regulate intense emotions. So the theory that we use to explain what has occurred that led to this behavior is the biosocial theory. So we're going to give you a brief overview of what it is, and also we're going to tell you why this is important in a second. So you look at this box here, there's quite a bit of information, so we're going to go to each one in a little more detail. So we have the biology. So this could be an innate sensitivity to stimuli. So this is what we call biological emotional vulnerability, or a predisposition to a mood disorder. So an inability to effectively regulate emotions. And the bottom right-hand corner, we have the social. So this is the environment. So what we're looking at is invalidation, where it's communicating to the person that what they're feeling, thinking, or doing doesn't make sense. And it may also be considered as inaccurate or overreacting. And then one of the most important part we often forget is the middle part, is that arrow. This is transacting with. So this is time, when this transaction between the biology and the environment over time. So let's look at each of these components in more detail. So when we're looking at biology, what we're looking at is the biological emotional vulnerability. So for all of us, we are on the spectrum somewhere in regards to our emotional vulnerability. Some of us are more sensitive to emotions, some of us are not. I'm sure you have people in your life who, who's very good at logic, but can tell you how they feel on the best days. You have some people who are very sensitive to emotions, they're very expressive, they're able to actually utilize their emotions effectively to do certain things. So we are all somewhere on this spectrum. So with people who have emotional vulnerability, what we're looking at is, number one, is there's a high emotional sensitivity. So this is a emotion that will come on very quick. And also, there usually don't need to be much stimuli. Don't need to be much happening within the environment to have this immediate and quick emotional response. And also is high emotional reactivity, is that the reaction is extreme. It's 0 to 100 very quickly. And a lot of times is the emotions are dictating the decision making rather than the inner wisdom. And almost it's impulsive in the moment decisions are driven by the current emotional experience. And also what we also see is last part is that slow return to baseline. They have this very high sensitivity, very quick reaction, very intense experience, and it lasts a long time. It takes quite a while for them to get back to baseline, and they become sensitized before the next event, which means that this will occur over and over again. That is not just a exclusive event that even before the next event occurs, even that anticipation or the thought about the next thing happening will create that extreme reaction. So, to summarize, for what young people are experiencing is that inability to effectively regulate emotions. A lot of times they would describe as almost their emotions are controlling them rather than they're controlling their emotions. And that's what we're looking at in the bio, is the biological vulnerability to emotions. In the environment, what we're looking at is validation versus invalidation. So a lot of people will hear the word validation, they immediately think praise. They think invalidation, they think abuse or assault or violence. Yes, those are definitely fit within those categories, but validation is so much more than that. So what validation is, the definition, is that one's existence makes sense in their context. So what invalidation is then is one's existence does not make sense in their context. So if we look at the extreme examples, if we look at abuse, assault, violence, yes, that is extremely validating because it makes no sense for the context of the person to be in. Human beings are not meant to be hurt. And for young people, they're definitely not meant to be injured or hurt by the people who are supposed to care for them. So abuse is definitely the ultimate form of validation. But validation, if the definition is that their existence doesn't make sense in the context, could be something as simple as a poor fit, that you could be a rose in the tulip garden. And you could also be a poor fit. So sometimes is that you may be in an environment with somebody else, somebody who's active, and you're more of a passive person. You're more of an extrovert, you're more introvert, and that poor fit can also sometimes be invalidating. So environments could be anything. It could be people, like parents, teachers, peers, therapists, coaches, others. It could be contexts. This could be settings. It could be structures that doesn't fit the person's existence. So for somebody who needs structure, a very flexible environment is actually very invalidating. For somebody who needs flexibility, structure is actually very invalidating. So it's very specific on the individual. And usually what we look at the invalidation is also it's pervasive. It's not just one time. Invalidation happens day to day. What we're looking at is that pervasive happens again and again and again. It continues to communicate to the person that their existence doesn't make sense. So this then also goes into a lot of times people will feel as, oh, it's my fault. No, that's not actually the case, because a poor fit is not necessarily your fault. That we're just in the context we're in. We didn't purposely make this happen. One thing though with invalidation that's interesting is external invalidation, because it's communicating to the person that their existence doesn't make sense, will slowly turn into self-invalidation. Because if a person feels that they don't make sense in the world we're in, eventually they will start to think that it's their fault. That I don't fit in the world I'm in because there's something wrong with me. That is not the world. It's obviously me because I don't fit. So then it leads into self-invalidation. And again, that external invalidation will reinforce the self-invalidation, and it just continues to occur time and time again. And then the person will eventually get to a place where they can actually be able to trust their own experiences. Either it's emotional or logical. That because they don't make sense, then nothing that who I am makes any sense. So before we look at the video, there's the third part. The third part is the time. So just because a person who is has high biological vulnerability emotions and are in an invalidating environment doesn't mean that they will get to a place where there's dysregulation. There needs to be transaction between the two. And that's the third factor we often forget. So the two needs to have interaction. So a quick demo here in the diagram. So, if you are somebody who doesn't like eggs, let's say you're just not an egg person, you never liked eggs, and you live in the household where everybody loves eggs, they're cooking egg every day, but they do it in the morning. So invalidate environment, biological vulnerability to eggs, okay, as a stimuli. But let's say every morning you leave before everyone gets up, you go to work, you actually leave the house, you actually never see anybody cooking the egg in the environment. There's no interaction, which means that this will actually never lead to any actual transaction and get to a place of dysregulation. We're going to come back to this diagram in a second again about how it escalates over time, but let's look at a quick video on the emotional sensitivity that we talk about in biology.
What comes to mind when you hear the word sensitive? Tears, low tolerance, thin skin, easily offended, inflexible, weak, shy, anxious, exaggerating the effects of pain? How often do we hear sensitive used as a criticism, a negative, something that people need to get over in order to enter the real world? Maybe you've been on the receiving end of this kind of thing yourself, told you need to grow up, to be stronger, to stop being so sensitive. Do you think about and notice little details that other people seem to ignore? Do you long to get away from loud noises, bright lights and overwhelming situations? Do you spend a lot of time worrying about how other people are feeling? Don't worry, there's nothing wrong with you. In fact, according to the research that Elaine Aron and other people have done over the past few decades, 15 to 20% of the population are what she describes as highly sensitive people. Carl Jung called it innate sensitiveness, referring to people who may process sensory data much more deeply and thoroughly due to a biological difference in their nervous systems. This sensitivity boils down to the way that we process the sensory input from the world, and the fact that we get overwhelmed more easily than other people by the things around us that travel through our sensory processing system. It's built into who we are, and like it or not, there is not much we can do about it. High processing sensitivity has already been found in over 100 species, including flies, birds, fish, and dogs. These highly sensitive beings have a different survival instinct, being observant before acting. Your brain processes information and reflects on it much more deeply as a highly sensitive person. You're also more easily overwhelmed as a result. When things are too intense, complex, chaotic, or novel for a long time, a highly sensitive person gets overstimulated. This trait has often been misunderstood. Because highly sensitive people prefer to look before entering new situations, they're often called shy. But shyness is learned, not innate. It's also been compared to introversion, so you may be surprised to know that 30% of highly sensitive people are actually extroverts. In cultures where it's not valued, highly sensitive people tend to have low self-esteem. We need to increase our awareness and understanding of high sensitivity as a society, otherwise we will fail to appreciate and enjoy the many wonderful gifts that the highly sensitive among us can bring. For more information, go to www.sheepdressedlikewolves.com.
All right, so let's go back to the diagram again quickly, just to give a demonstration of how the three factors come into play between biology and their environment and transaction over time. So PJ, if you don't mind putting up the diagram again, just after the video there. So just to give a quick, demonstration as how this works, how invalidation environment and, with emotional sensitivity lead to dysregulation when it becomes actually extreme behaviors. So let's say, for example, I come to the office and I say hi to PJ, and PJ turns his head. So then what I tend to do is increase my behavior. I say a little louder, hey PJ, how's it going? He turns his head again even more. There's more invalidation. So now I increase my behavior a little bit. I get to yelling, hey PJ, are you there? Turns his head again. So finally I get to a point where I go up there, I punch him in the back of the head. And he finally goes, oh Ed, how's it going? Let's say this occurs for the next 45 months. What's going to happen on 46 months when I see PJ? I'm probably just going to punch him in the head the minute I see him. That is the transaction between the behavior and invalidation over time. So why is this important? Let's take a look. So important because it provides a new perspective on self-interest behaviors. And also because there's three factors at play, it eliminates blame. That is no one's fault. It's not the environment's fault. It's not even the person's fault. And it's not even the time's fault, because you need all three factors in play over time to get to where we are today. And also moves away from shame. Because a lot of times when people who are self-harming, one thing they experience, they feel shameful. They feel as if there's something wrong with me because of so much invalidations that occur in the environment, and they're invalidating themselves. This actually gives a context where it's actually, no, your biological sensitivity actually is adaptive, because emotions actually provides us with information that logic can't. It provides with information about our environment in the immediate time. Logic is very good for tomorrow and yesterday, doesn't necessarily tell us what's going on right now. So the emotional information is not necessarily a curse. It's actually a gift. For a lot of people who are especially, in sectors that requires dealing with people or dealing with arts or anything that's expressive, emotional understanding is actually, and sensitivity to emotions, are actually very helpful and very effective. So that they're not weak or defective people. What it also does then is promote skill building. Why? Because if there's three ways in, there's three ways out. We can give you skills to help you regulate your biology, your sensitivity, so you don't have that high reaction, intense reaction, and also that prolonged return to baseline. We can give you skills to increase the validation in your environment so there's not so much invalidation. We can also give you skills to stop the transaction for the two from interacting. So there's three ways in and three ways out. And ultimately, it will promote emotion regulation. It promotes the fact that you can actually be in control of your existence, and who you are makes sense. So let's talk about what do we do, what not to do, so on and so forth. So if we have a young person who's, self-harming, what are some things we can do are helpful? So number one that we often either coach, parents or caregivers or professionals, is to maintain neutrality. So this is why that mindfulness exercise is so important, because your reaction will immediately affect how you're able to maintain neutrality. You're going to bring your emotional experience into the interaction. So you want to avoid displays of shock or surprise, avoid shaming your behavior, avoid pity response. And the reason for this, because we talked about in the biosocial theory, is for people who have high sensitivity to emotions, they will take any stimuli as an emotional stimuli, and then the response will occur. So neutrality is actually something that you need to practice as professionals or as caregivers or as individuals who are young people as a first line. And then also, before responding, take a moment for yourself. And what do? Number one, you actually need to differentiate, is this a non-suicidal self-injury or is it a suicidal attempt? If the intent is to die, we have a safety issue. Now, a safety plan or emergency services maybe need to be involved. If the intent is not to die, it is actually to regulate, or as a way to avoid, or as a way to, alter the environment because of the validation, then you can perhaps proceed. So you also need to assess the medical safety of self-interest behavior. Just because the intent is not to die does not mean the cut is going to be superficial. A lot of times for young people, because they're in the moment where there's high emotional experience, they will do something that they did not mean to do. They may cut too deep. They may cut in the area they're not supposed to cut. They may burn the place when they're supposed to burn. So if there's medical safety that requires stitches, if the bleeding is not stopping, if the burn is too big or too severe, attend to the medical safety first. And then also you might want to identify any group involvement. So this is what we look at, any contagion. Sometimes for our young people who are in schools or in group settings, sometimes the cutting is actually occurring not individually, but as collectively. So then you also need to look at maybe there's some things we need to do so that we can actually stop that contagion effect. That maybe it's actually an imitation behavior rather than they actually want to do it. And they're doing it because their friends are doing it or other people are telling them they want to do it. So this could also not be physical group involvement. Right now, digital groups are very popular. TikTok is one. I can't say I've ever been on there. I may have. I don't know. I can't tell anymore. There's so many of them. So that could also be group involvement. So that also needs to be taken account of. And also be aware of any contingency and reinforcers. Every behavior usually is something reinforcing it. So it could be that you're reinforcing it through your responses. It could be that there's some social reinforcers going on with this group involvement or on social media. Could also be that one of the reinforcers is the relief, like PJ talked about. It actually helps them regulate the emotional experience. So if that's the case, then you might need to introduce a skill, which we're going to actually talk about later on in this workshop, that will give them the same amount of relief without actually needing them to hurt themselves. So here's some screening questions you can ask. So here's the thing. Do not be around the bush. The reason because if you be around the bush, what will happen is actually you're going to seem as if you're anxious about the behavior, which then lead into the individual, the young person, thinking that if you're not comfortable talking about it, then maybe this is something that I shouldn't be talking about. So if you're going to ask them about their cutting or their self-injurious behavior, then actually ask them. I mean, don't judge, don't assume, but be as clear as possible. Could be, have you ever cut yourself on purpose? Could be, what methods have you used before? Could be, what does cutting do for you? A lot of young people actually know what cutting does for them. They actually will tell you that, you know what, when I cut, I am not as anxious. Or when I cut, I'm not as sad. There's like that brief 5 minutes where I feel like I'm free. Could be, how and where did you learn to hurt yourself? So this is where you're assessing if there's contagion, if there's group involvement, who else knows about your cutting? Because this also could see if there's actual adequate support already involved, or somebody may be reinforcing it. It could be, how often do you self-harm? So again, the frequency of the behavior is also important to note, because if it's happening more often, that means it's probably being reinforced for a prolonged period of time. Do you experience suicidal thoughts? Again, you need to, assess for safety and differentiate between non-suicidal self-injury and suicidal behavior and thoughts. When do you experience suicidal thoughts, and what do you do when you have suicidal thoughts? So I have a question here. What about when something seems to be NSSI, but the self-harm is significant enough that it needs medical attention, stitches? Would it fall into duty to report for a minor if the intent was not to end their life? So it would depend on your relationship with the young person. So, if you're, let's say your relationship with the young person is you're the caregiver, so obviously then you would need to attend to the, medical safety. You need to make sure that stitches are, being applied or whatever it may be, to make sure that there's no medical safety. If you are an external professional, so a teacher, youth worker, so on and so forth, then, the actual, important thing is, first, you need to differentiate, is this an intent to die or not? So if it's not, if it's just self-injury, then, having the young person with you to actually seek support is probably going to be most important. Remember, we also want to reinforce skill use. We don't want to just focus on the cutting, because then that's the behavior that's going to be reinforced. So it's like, okay, you cut, there's no medical safety. I'm your teacher. Who knows about this? Does your mom know? Does your dad know? Do you have a therapist? Does your therapist know? Have you done this before? And if there's any skillful means, you actually reinforce that. Maybe they'll tell you, actually, my mom knows. My mom, found out I cut a month ago. She doesn't know I cut today, but she did know. So then now it's moved into, are you willing to talk to your mom about it? And we can do it together if you need to. So one thing, what you probably don't want to do is do it for the young person, because what that moves into, even if it's the best intention, it actually becomes invalidating, because you're taking the choice away from the person of being skillful. So I hope that answers your question. If you have any, if you'd like to elaborate on that question, feel free to ask. I'm happy to further answer that. So let's move into the next slide. Some other screening questions could be, do you think your cutting is a problem? So we also need to look at is that insight. Sometimes our young people actually don't want to cut. They're cutting because they have to, and it's been helpful for them to regulate. Some young person actually endorses the cutting. So you also need to see where they're at. What would happen for you to think this is a problem? So again, we're looking at insight. Do you want to stop cutting? You can actually directly ask, do you want to stop? And a lot of them will tell you they do. A lot of them are ambivalent. What are the reasons you want to stop cutting? Have you tried to stop? When other things have you tried? So we're looking at skillful means. What other things can you do instead? Do you ever try other things? Do they help? Do you know what treatment options are available? So again, a lot of these questions are really moving towards skill use rather than, focusing on the actual cutting behavior. So another question is, were they cut important to assess at this time as well? Yeah, so that would be an important, thing to look at, because if superficial cutting on the arm versus superficial cutting on the eye are going to be two different things. One's going to lead to potential blindness. One is probably be some minor scarring. So again, you had to look at that, assess that medical safeties where they're cutting. That's important for young people who are usually using it as a way to regulate emotions. Common places is forearms, upper arm, thighs, sometimes on the stomach. They don't want to die. The intent is not to actually, get to a place where they will have long-term medical concerns. So they usually will avoid areas that's going to be, more detrimental or catastrophic. That does not mean that they will always make the effective decision. So asking that is always going to be best. All right. So what not to do. So number one is, do not try to be the therapist unless you're the therapist. If you're the therapist, please be their therapist. So do not try to be their therapist because, they actually have not made the choice to actually, to address it. So if you become a therapist, you're actually taking the choice from the young person. You can support their choice to actually, get help, or to talk to the therapist if they do have one, but do not try to be their therapist. And do not expect them to stop overnight or in a short period of time, because when we look at biosocial theory, it was transaction over time. So it's going to take time for the skillful behaviors to be in play. A lot of times also behaviors are conditioned. So what does that mean? Is we learn by association. We feel hungry in the kitchen. We don't necessarily feel hungry in the bathroom. We have learned by association with our behavior and the context we're in. So a lot of times, cutting behaviors could be a conditioned response. That emotional distress automatically has conditioned to self-harm, so the self-urge kicks in. So it also takes time to decondition the behavior over time. It's not going to happen right away. So do not react strong emotionally. So again, because we don't want to judge and also come off as, as an emotional stimuli for young people. Do not physically struggle with them as they're about to self-harm. So what we usually recommend, if the individual has a knife in their hand, or you see that, in the situation you're in, then they may be able to self-harm, either be directive, ask them to let it go, or if you don't know what to do, at that point, you can contact emergency services to intervene, because now we have a potential, safety issue if they have a weapon in their hand when they're about to self-harm. Do not make them promises to promise not to do it, because again, if they do, because a conditioned response oftentimes takes time, sometimes people will, lapse. Then if they do it, what follows is shame. Contracts, there's actually no data that shows contracts work. So please do not default to a contract. Definitely do not make them feel comfortable for their self-harm. Do not respond warmly. So here's the thing. We're not saying judge and be cold. We're saying be neutral. A warm response to the cutting behavior will reinforce the behavior. For human beings, social reinforcers, the strongest reinforcers, either implicit or explicit. So a warm response to a cutting behavior, which is the not effective behavior, will actually increase the self-harm. So maintain neutrality is key here. do not respond to request medical first aid if possible. So if you see the self-harm is superficial, is that there's barely any blood, they may need a Band-Aid, what we actually recommend as a caregiver or as a professional is guide them in getting first aid themselves. So maybe show them where the bandages, they can put it on, and you can kind of guide them through putting it on, but don't do it for them. Again, what you're reinforcing, and when they actually do that, is then you actually reinforce that, because you're reinforcing skillful means rather than reinforcing the behavior if you attend to them every time they do cut. All right, so I'm gonna pause there because I got a few questions here. So would you support a harm reduction approach? So I probably need a bit more information as you mean by that. If you're, I'm going to assume, I don't want to assume, but what you mean by is, having the young person cut maybe once a week rather than twice a week. No, we do not. So the reason for that is and this moves into when we talk about in our training, especially sometimes cutting behavior for young people when it's so entrenched, it becomes almost of addictive nature to it, that the urge is so strong that sometimes it's conditioned that the craving will come in. So what we actually teach, what we call dialectical abstinence, is actually the middle path between harm reduction and the abstinence model. So I don't have time today to really look at that. But to give you a quick recap, a quick 30-second explanation is to commit to not cutting. At the same time, if you do cut, do not shame yourself and do not fall into the validation to say, if I cut once and I cut 1,000 times, and move back, fight as hard as you can, move back into abstinence in that moment. So it's moment by moment. There's definitely more to that. Unfortunately, I don't have time for that. It's about an hour and a half of training just for that skill. So question, do these apply to parents? Yes, they do. So can you please give an example of a response? Yes. So let's say you see a young person, there's a cut, they just freshly cut with maybe, let's say, X-Acto knife, it's superficial, it's not bleeding. So sometimes parents will go, oh my God, are you okay? Why don't I make you some tea, sit down, let me take a look at it. We'll watch a movie that you like. Let me know how you feel. And you have a long discussion and warm response and care for that. That is a warm response. What would be a neutral response is, okay, you cut, I see that. Do you know what to do? They'll go like, no. Okay, I'll let you know. First aid kit is in the drawer. Do you know how to get to it? Yes. Okay, let's see you do it. Do you find it? All right. Do you know how to apply the bandage? Yes. Okay, let's see you do it. Are you all good? Good. All right. What are you going to do now? I think I'm going to go watch a movie. All right, enjoy your movie. That will be a neutral but still supportive response. So using elastic or paper clips is a method that's less harmful. So that is also, again, that moves into harm reduction. We typically do not, unless it's a skill that we teach specifically. What we don't want to do is replace the behavior, which is the less lethal means, because the function is the same. The function is to regulate. They're still using an ineffective behavior to regulate. So what we want to do is actually replace that behavior with a skillful means, rather than just replacing with a less lethal behavior, but still ineffective. So would showing them not to apply first aid themselves, not teach them that it's harmless and fixable. Sorry, I got to read that question here. Would showing them how to apply first aid themselves, not teach them that's harmless and fixable. Just give me a minute to understand this question. There's a lot of nots. So is your question showing them how to apply first aid, teach them that that it's okay for the behavior? So remember, the first aid is not, we are doing the first aid for the individual to do it themselves, is to not to reinforce the behavior. So if they know how to do it, you just say, yep, get you to do it. And you actually you can check in with them later. You don't have to stand there and watch them do it. If they know how to do it, you can just check them, did you do it? Yep, okay, good. And that's it. So what we don't want to do is go above the capacity of the individual in your response. So again, is back to is what they're able to do. What choices they're able to make that's going to be effective. So in that sense, and you're not reinforcing the behavior. And also the idea is that, if you are cutting, is this is something we probably need to address. Is that we also cannot ignore the second part, is that we need to get you some skillful means to cope with this. I'm just not going to talk about it. Is actually, you know what, this is, especially if you're a parent, is that in the house, this is not something that is acceptable. And I understand you're doing it. I understand that this time may be difficult to change, and we need to start doing some things to make those changes. So would one check-in, have you cut this week? So we usually, if you're a parent, what we don't usually recommend is for you to ask 21 questions with our young people in the home. Again, it's going to come into, because let's say that the behavior is decreasing and they're actually using skillful means, it's actually going to come off as judgmental. There's going to be objective markers where you can probably see that they're probably still cutting. So remember the signs we talked about earlier in this workshop? Long sleeves, maybe there's some behaviors where they're hiding things. You're going to see bloody things around the house. Sometimes people will purchase blades or hoard blades and things to cut with. So there's other objective markers you can look at. You can also look at as to, how you can also just check in, rather than check in if they did cut, is check in is with the skillful means. It's like, how are you doing this week? How are things? Do you think, whatever you're doing is helping, or, are you finding the therapy working, so on and so forth. So just concern the neutral response might instead be interpreted as cold, especially for sensitive people or uncaring, how to show care while reinforcing the behavior. So neutrality doesn't mean cold. You're still supportive. So you're still helping them with the concerns that they may have if it's, indeed a medical safety. If they're able to care for themselves, you just have them do it themselves. So, this is something we actually do in our work with our young people ourselves, and we actually practice to be neutral. I don't really have much time today and to show you how that works. It's actually quite a bit of a training that we do, even the clinicians that's been doing this for a while. So unfortunately, but I can tell you that is what is effective. If parents start validating the teen's feeling, is that okay? Yes, you can definitely validate the feeling. So not the behavior of cutting. Are we seeing a correlation between the age of SI being younger due to the pandemic? I don't have any data on that. I'm not sure. We are seeing, though, like PJ said, that the self-harm behavior is getting younger overall. This could be a number of factors. It could be dissemination of information. This could be, increased access to means, but we're not sure. You mentioned that kids have craving to self-harm. Is there any physiological effects like drugs? Yeah, so one thing we talked about briefly earlier where Peter was talking about the regulation piece is that, physical injury, unlike emotional pain, creates a sense of relief in the brain, that your brain will naturally create, endorphins and painkillers to deal with the injury. However, emotional pain and physical pain are both the same receptors in the brain. So emotional pain does not evoke the same response. So that's why a lot of young people will use self-harm as a way to regulate, because that will actually activate that neural pathway. So parents need to find opportunities to work the attachment relationship, not related to youth self-harm behaviors, I'm guessing. Is that a question? I'm not sure. If you have a question, feel free to ask. I'm not sure if that's a question, just a statement. Anyways, let's move back to what we're looking at so we can move forward here. So do not indulge in lengthy discussion about self-harm methods. So again, we don't want to reinforce the behavior or increase the information about self-harm, and do not help in researching different methods of self-harm. So let's look at what to do. Maintain neutrality that we said, number one, and be aware how your behavior can influence future self-harm. So also, like we did in the beginning with that mindfulness exercise, is looking at what your reactions are and what are the things you're doing that may be potentially reinforcing the behavior. And talk to them when they feel like self-harming. So preferably before they self-harm, because again, with them, we're definitely not reinforcing behavior. The behavior has not occurred. And you can talk to them about how they're feeling, the distress they're in, their pain they're in prior to self-harming. Recommend self-administered first aid that we just talked about. Help in research and reasons of self-harm. The more they understand as to what the function of behavior is, the more likely they also be able to change it. One thing that we do in our center, and the one big part of DBT is orientation. We orient our clients and our clinician to everything we do, because in order to change a behavior, you must help them understand the current behavior and orient to the new one. Help them in active problem solving, so whatever that may look like. Help in seeing self-harm, and skill use is active choices, that you have a choice. You are in control of either to choose using skills or to hurt yourself. And then, of course, reinforce effective skill use and recommend treatment and contact treatment providers if necessary. So here's some readings that potentially could help you if you need further elaboration. So there's a text by Michael Hollander, who has a book. It's exactly the same title as our workshop, called Helping Teens Who Cut. It's actually written for both clinicians and also for parents and tertiary professionals and teachers and school counselors, called Helping Teens Who Cut. It's actually very helpful and very effective. For those who are maybe in the helping field, DBT with suicidal adolescents is also a very good resource. We're going to talk more about that a little bit towards when we introduce a little bit what DBT is.
So some goals, if we are going to involve an outside professional like a counselor and whatnot, there are some things to consider when making our choices. So we would want there to be certain elements, or recommend that there be certain elements that would be more effective to include. And one would be to increase effective emotion regulation. And so, because if one of the things that is primarily going on is an actual skill deficit in effectively regulating emotions, or a belief that it's ineffective, then to increase an effective emotion regulation system and to gain some self-efficacy in it would be a beneficial goal. We want to increase effective social connectedness. So we want people connecting in adaptive, reinforced ways that are going to help them to feel like they are part of something and belonging, rather than staying connected to something where the contingency of their involvement is continuing to engage in a behavior like self-harming behavior. We also want to increase our ability to tolerate stress. How can I get through a problem when things are really distressing without making it worse? How can I live to fight another day? And we want to also decrease impulsivity, because a lot of times impulsive behaviors can lead to unintended consequences. We're really desperate to do something in a moment, and that impulsivity can often lead to things that have consequences that we later regret, or possibly even accidentally cause more harm or more damage, either physically, psychologically, or socially, than we were intending. We want to decrease extreme thinking, because a lot of times, especially in our adolescent years, because our brain hasn't fully developed until we're in middle adulthood, in our mid-20s, then what doesn't happen is that cognitive flexibility, that ability to be really abstract. And so we want to decrease that black and white, either or extreme thinking that tends to naturally go along with adolescence, but when there's a high emotional sensitivity, tends to get even more polarized. We also want to decrease the avoidance of emotional experiences, because sometimes that can be one of the things that actually leads to an increase in ways of coping that aren't actually very helpful. And so if we can actually learn how to be in and effectively tolerate and experience an entire repertoire of emotions and know what to do with those emotions and feel effective in dealing with those emotions, it is more likely to be effective. And we could consider a treatment like DBT. DBT has a lot of evidence behind it, which we're going to get into here in a second, just as one of the options that both research has shown us and in our experience has been very effective with concerns like this. So as a really brief introduction to DBT, it stands on 3 pillars: mindfulness, dialectics, and behaviorism. So in short, it's a broad array of things. There's lots of things under the DBT strategies, but what we want to look at here is, it's held up by mindfulness and awareness of being fully in the present moment, being fully aware of what's going on in us and around us, and more connected to reality as it is. helps us to accept things as they are. If we can accept things as they are, then we can use behavioral strategies like, increasing the likelihood of meeting our goals, decreasing the likelihood of things getting in the way of our goals, and structuring the environment around us to help us be more successful, so that we are more likely to get into our place where life is really worth living, and therefore we don't need such a difficult way of dealing with things. And dialectics isn't a psychological term, it's actually a philosophy term. So what we're going to do here is introduce the reality that, or the perspective that, on one hand, something can be true, and on the other hand, something that seems completely opposite can also be true. And those two things that seem the opposite can both be true at the same time. So those are the three. There's much more detail to go into here, and that's beyond the scope of what we're going to do tonight. We just want to make sure that there's just at least the briefest of introductions there. And speaking of brief introductions, here's DBT in a nutshell.
Hi, I'm Dr. Esme Schaller. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I direct the DBT program at the Young Adult and Family Center at UCSF. I'm here to answer the question, what the heck is DBT? If you're watching this, someone has told you that you or a family member could benefit from something called DBT. The goal of this video is to explain quickly and simply what people mean when they say DBT, who DBT is designed to help, and what being in DBT treatment might actually look like. The main goal of DBT is to build a life worth living. This means having things that are meaningful and important to you in your life. So this could mean music to one person, horses to another, and a quiet room with lots of books to someone else. DBT is not a suicide prevention program or a way to stop people from doing behaviors that bother others. DBT is to help you. In other words, there is hope if you're suicidal. DBT is one way to overcome these feelings. Let's start with explaining those letters. Acronyms are always a bit confusing. The D stands for dialectical. This is a fancy philosophy word based on the idea of a dialectic, or two things that can seem like opposites but can in fact both be true at the same time. For example, in DBT, we believe that everyone is doing the best they can, and they need to try harder. We often think of dialectics as a great big scale, tilting back and forth. The main dialectic in DBT is that we are always trying to balance acceptance, you're doing the best you can, this is really how life is right now, with change. You have to try different things to get the life you want, you have to be motivated and work harder. A DBT therapist is thus constantly dancing, trying to make sure they really understand and accept where you're coming from, while also pushing you to change when they can. It can be a complicated step. The B stands for behavior. A behavior is anything that can be reinforced or rewarded. Okay, let me briefly explain reinforcement too. A reinforcer is anything that increases the likelihood that a behavior will occur again. If you study hard and get an A+ on a test, the A+ is the reinforcer that increases the chances you will study again. If your dog sits and you give him a treat, the treat is the reinforcer that increases the chance he will sit again. If you do a favor for a friend and he brings you a present to thank you, the present is the reinforcer that increases the chances you will do more favors in the future. The laws of behavior, having to do with these reinforcers, affect all living things: dogs, dolphins, people, even therapists. DBT recognizes this and tries to harness the power of behavior change to move you closer to your goals, your life worth living. In DBT, therapists work with you to establish target behaviors, things that you are working to increase, or often in the beginning, decrease, to make your life better. Common initial targets in DBT include thinking of suicide, self-injury, restricting meals, binging and purging, using drugs or alcohol, engaging in risky sexual behavior, reckless driving, physical aggression, and shoplifting. The T stands for therapy, obviously. But DBT is different from other therapies you may have participated in or heard of. DBT therapists have a lot of specialized training in DBT and follow many assumptions and guidelines in their work as DBT therapists that differ from other therapy traditions. All of this is a bit beyond the scope of this video, but I'll let you in on a couple. Our first goal in DBT is making sure you stay alive. This helps us meet our second goal, making sure you stay in therapy until you can meet your goal, which is by far the most important, building a life worth living. DBT therapists believe that the most caring thing a therapist can do is to help push a client toward their long-term goals. Sometimes these goals may seem unattainable. It is a DBT therapist's job to understand how hard it is to change and to simultaneously push you to keep you moving forward. DBT therapists also believe that therapy with someone is a real relationship between equals. That means if you ask your therapist a question about their lives, they'll likely just answer it honestly instead of asking you why you're interested. It also means that the work in therapy is carried out by both of you. It's like a DBT therapist is in a rowboat with you, and you are both rowing to get to your destination. Your therapist shouldn't be laying back silently while you row super hard. And you also shouldn't be in the back of the boat drilling little holes in the bottom while your therapist is up front rowing, thinking you're rowing too. It's about both of you working together towards your goals. Now, who can benefit most from DBT? DBT has been studied and is currently being studied for a lot of different clinical populations. What most of them have in common is a difficulty in regulating emotions. This may mean that your life feels a bit like an emotional roller coaster. DBT might work for you if you get more disappointed than it seems like your friends do when plans get canceled or things don't go your way. You cry at movies a lot, or even at commercials. You sometimes feel like you were born into the wrong family, like you're a lion cub in a family of house cats. If one or more of these things describes you, you might benefit from DBT. Lastly, let's talk about what DBT looks like. Full DBT, the kind that has the most rigorous research backing it up, has 4 modes of treatment. These are: 1. Structured individual therapy. There is a focus on behaviors, like we mentioned, and dialectics, that balance of acceptance and change. You'll also be asked to do some tracking of your emotions and behaviors in between sessions. If you're a teen, or sometimes a young adult, family therapy will also be included as part of your DBT program. 2. Skills group. This is a weekly meeting, usually about 2 hours long, where you get to learn a different behavioral skill each week to help manage emotions, tolerate distress, and have effective interpersonal relationships. This saves time in your individual therapy to talk about the stuff that's most central to you. If you're a teen or young adult, you'll likely attend this group with a family member or two so they can learn the skills as well. 3. Skills coaching. This means you can call your therapist 24 hours a day to get help using your coping skills and to avoid engaging in some of those target behaviors we mentioned earlier. You have a personal coach that can help you change how you react to things at times when it is the hardest to do so. 4. Consultation team. This last one may be less obvious to you as the client, but DBT therapists work on a team that helps them support each other and do the best treatment possible. This is essential because changing life-threatening behaviors that have been going on for a long time can be really stressful. If your DBT therapist does not have a team, it's not DBT. Altogether, this takes about 3 to 4 hours per week. Another goal of DBT is to keep you in your life, going to school, going to work, seeing your friends, so it does not take up all of your time like some other intensive treatment options might. So, you now know what the heck dialectical behavior therapy is. You've got the acronym down, you know a little bit about who it's designed to help, and you know what it involves. Only you can choose if this is the right road to your life worth living. Why not talk to a DBT therapist and see what you think?
So that's DBT in a nutshell. We don't have an opportunity tonight to go through all the research, all the supporting data, and all the rest of it. And there are certainly many things to consider, but the ultimate goal is building a life worth living. Because ultimately, if life is worth living, then we have something to work towards instead of just stopping or trying to decrease the frequency of the behavior. So one of the things we wanted to do before we concluded our time today is to look at least one DBT skill, and we're going to zoom in and look at one part of one DBT skill. So This is a distress tolerance skill. What we were saying earlier was we need to learn ways to tolerate distress so that if our emotions are overwhelming, what we want to do is help our biology, to help our brain, to help our emotions so that we can buy time. Now, this skill isn't meant to solve problems. It's not meant to cure. It's not meant to fix. It's meant to buy time, to tolerate distress. It's not going to fix everything in and of itself. But if we can buy time to regulate our emotions even just a little bit, if we can go from 10 out of 10 down to an 8 or a 7, then what we'll be able to do then is hopefully then be able to do other more effective things, seek out our supportive relationships, and do all of the other things to help continue to regulate those emotions down even further. Because what we know about our brains is it's really tough to use logic and problem solve and think something through when we're at 10 out of 10. Our brains just aren't wired to do that. Our cognitive centers go offline. So we need to do something to actually come down a little bit. And so of these 4 possible interventions, temperature, intense exercise, paced breathing, and paired muscle relaxation, we're going to zoom in on the first one, temperature. And this comes largely out of the research. They actually started with the military. And, when they were training Navy divers, they noticed that when the divers, whom they were monitoring all their vital signs to make sure that they were, fit and safe and all the rest of it during training, they noticed that when the divers hit the cold water, something interesting happened biologically. Their heart rate slowed down, their breathing regulated, and their circulation started going from their extremities back into their core. And somewhere along the lines, the scientists and psychologists went, holy crow, this is amazing. This is exactly what we need to do when somebody is experiencing high emotional distress. How do we replicate this dive reflex in real life? And so one of the things that we can do is actually replicate the dive reflex in real life by cooling a very particular branch of a very particular nerve that happens to have a lot of nerve centers in our face. So we're going to actually take a really quick look at a short demonstration of that, and I'll explain it a little bit more, and then we'll take a few more questions.
I do it is I get a big bowl, big enough for me to actually put my head in, and I fill this up with cold water. Now, how cold does the water need to be? That kind of depends on you. I would experiment with this a little bit until you're able to find a temperature that kind of works for you. I like putting ice cubes in it. It kind of brings down the temperature a little bit more. That's optional. You might not have to do this yourself. If you're in a situation like school or work and you can't easily do this, you have a few other options. You can take a big giant Ziploc bag and put water in there. You can have a cold compress. Maybe you can go to a nurse's office at school, or maybe you can have one of these, something like that, in your work freezer if you have one. You can also take a paper towel or a towel and wet that with cold water. You can simulate some of those things, but they're not going to be as effective, because what needs to happen is this area over here, sort of your eyes and your nose area, and especially inside your nostrils, these areas need to be exposed to cold water. That's number 1. Number 2, you have to hold your breath. And number 3, you have to keep that going for about 15 to 30 seconds. Those are the combination of things that are required to trigger this reflex. All of this works best if you're in an environment where there's not too many distractions and you can just kind of focus in on this. That being said, if you're in a tough spot, you're surrounded by a lot of people, go to a bathroom stall and you can replicate some of this stuff. Oh, I've even done this with a really cold bottle of water. Taking a bottle of water, putting it in the freezer for a little bit, that kind of brings down the temperature, and then kind of squeezing it around. That's another way to kind of replicate this. You could take that with you to the bathroom stall, put it around, and it gets pretty close. I'm going to show you how this actually works. First thing I want to do is get my heart rate. So I'm going to take my heart rate right now on my phone. I've been kind of talking quickly, so maybe my heart rate is a little bit higher than usual. Yeah, it looks like it's just a little up, 87 beats per minute. Should probably tuck my tie away because that would be not very smart. That tie would probably get kind of wet. Some people like to breathe out right before they do this. Some people like to breathe in. It doesn't really matter. Here we go. I'm gonna check my heart rate. 71 beats per minute. So you can see already it dropped down just after a little bit. It's a hard sensation to describe, but I can feel something happening, and I can feel the change in blood flow.
So, like I said, that is one way to buy some time. You can actually see the heart rate drop. The only thing we say, if like all things, if you've ever seen a medication commercial, particularly from, our neighbors to the south, there are disclaimers to everything. If you are really underweight, have low blood pressure, things like that, don't dip your face in ice water, you might pass out. But other than that, it's usually pretty safe for most people. And so when we use this skill, like you said, sometimes we got to troubleshoot it a little bit. Sometimes you got to be really creative using a cold compress, a bottle of ice water, those sorts of things. But you can replicate it fairly well, even just by splashing cold water on your face and things like that, to buy some time to then do something to regulate even more. So quick question here around, would this be effective for anxiety and a racing heart? Yes. Short answer, yes. So there are other things we would do with anxiety as well, but just by the biological nature of it decreasing our heart rate, then the racing heart will come down with a skill like this, and then buy us some time to then do something else with the problematic anxiety. So, this and many other things are a part of the bigger treatment of DVT, which we won't get into tonight, but it can be one thing. Like, these are what we're talking about when we said earlier, rather than using another thing that is an ineffective behavior to help to manage intense emotions, we want to start using effective skills to manage emotions, and then come alongside our young people to use these skills to help them be very effective. So there was a question earlier around how do you get more training and whatnot for therapists. If you want to learn more about DVT, you can be trained in DVT, and there's training coming up. Feel free to take a look at our website or any other out there about what to do. And we did want to also make sure that there is time for any other questions via the Q&A function as well. Does the tip skill apply to clients struggling with eating disorders? That's really broad, because if somebody is experiencing disordered eating that has them underweight, such as anorexia nervosa, and they're dangerously low on weight, then what we don't want to do is start introducing things that are going to drop their heart rate and blood pressure, or introduce things like intense exercise and whatnot, because it wouldn't be primarily used as a skill for treating an eating disorder like that. But as we said earlier, if the function of, for example, purging types of disorders or binge purge disorders is to regulate emotions, then the skills can be very effective in managing that. Any other questions coming up? That feel free to throw them into the Q&A function, and we will do our best to do as many as we can in the next 30 seconds or a minute that we have left. We want to honor the time as well here.
I did have a question that came in through the chat a while ago, saying it was when Ed was talking about the questions that you might pose to a teenager, and someone said these questions are great, but the average teenager will basically tell you to, like, get out of here, right? So how do you take those questions that are on the list and actually make it really apply to a real world teen?
Yeah, so this is where validation is key. So what we teach when it comes to validation skills, validation is the door that allows the connections to occur. So without validation, the door is closed. Doesn't matter how good your questions, how good your intervention is, it means nothing because the door is closed. There is no actual way of actually intervening. So what we default then is back to validation. Is if the teen is not in the place they want to talk, you actually send an invitation, say, when you're ready, or if you'd like to, please, I'm happy to hear. If you know, and then perhaps that may be a time where you can pose those questions. Or if there's an individual that they're willing to talk to about, it's like, you know what, I'm not going to ask you these questions, but if you're open to talking to somebody, I know you've been talking to somebody so and so, you know, maybe a teacher, counselor, whatever it may be, perhaps reinforce them accessing effective choices where they can actually have somebody who can be assistance to them.
Great. I see a whole bunch of questions coming in, and I'm also recognizing we're after 8 o'clock. I want to say the recording will be available. I'm going to kind of edit it up really quickly, and early next week it'll go out. I wonder if there's one more question in the Q&A that we can get to quickly.
We can probably answer them all. So for
okay.
the tip is a set of 4 questions, set of 4 skills. So we only introduced the temperature. So the tip is part of the distress tolerance module, and it's the skill set we teach when the distress is high. If individuals are 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 in distress and they can actually implement other skills, they actually need to get back to baseline very quickly. That's a set of skills we teach. So there's 4 skills in total. Today, I only have time to talk about the first one, temperature change. So what would you do if you know a youth is self-harming, but they're unwilling to engage in any support? So a lot of times caregivers and parents and also other people have this question. That we actually need to look at specifically what's happening in the environment that's reinforcing that behavior. So this is why we need to actually look at the function of the behavior in order for us to then increase validation in the environment, so then they're more likely to seek support and effective choices. So as much as I like give you a blank statement as to what you can do with a magic bullet, every youth is different. So we need to look at the individual and the environment they're in and what the transaction has been over time in order to answer that question more clearly.
Great. I think we'll wrap it like that. Hey, I want to thank both of you so much for being here and bringing this forward. You know, as a parent of a teen, it's been a complex time. And so I hope that everybody has gotten something out of tonight. We'll have the recording out, and have a great evening, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you all. You know, I tell our clients and every clinician that works with us something that my dad taught me actually. The most valuable thing you can give somebody is your time, because you can never get that back. So PJ and I thank you all for spending the last hour and a half with us and listening to us, and I hope this was helpful. If any questions, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to assist you further.
Bye, guys.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.